Invisible Hands, Episode 3, Sociopathy, Psychopathy, and Power. Hello and welcome back. Before we begin, let's slow this down again. This episode covers territory that often gets sensationalized or moralized, so it's important to name, right at the start, how this conversation is meant to be held. This is not an episode about monsters. It's not an episode about hunting for dangerous individuals, and it's not an invitation to see harm everywhere. What we're doing here is quieter and more demanding. We're staying with patterns, we're staying with systems, and we're staying with the uncomfortable truth that some forms of harm don't require cruelty, rage, or even emotional investment to function. If at any point you notice your body tense, your mind race ahead, or a reflex to categorize people quickly, that's not a failure. That's the nervous system responding to a topic that's usually framed in extremes. Nothing this episode requires you to make decisions, reevaluate relationships, or arrive at certainty. This is about orientation, not action. About understanding how certain dynamics operate, especially when power enters the equation, without turning that understanding into fear or judgment. So take this in slowly, let it land where it lands. And remember, awareness doesn't require alarm. When influence loses conscience, this is Invisible Hands, a series exploring manipulation, power, and the fracturing of perception. In the first two episodes, we focused on recognition. In episode 1, we explored how manipulation actually works, how confusion is created without force, how clarity erodes quietly, and why the body often knows something is wrong long before the mind can explain it. In episode 2, we examined the narcissistic pattern, not as a diagnosis, but as a relational strategy. We looked at how validation becomes regulation, how image replaces intimacy, and how admiration is often used not to connect, but to stabilize fragile systems of identity and control. In this episode, we move into different terrain, because while narcissistic dynamics revolve around attention, affirmation, and image, other patterns of influence are far less visible and often far more dangerous when paired with power. Today, we're exploring sociopathy, psychopathy, and power, not as labels for people, not as moral verdicts, but as strategies and traits that become particularly consequential inside systems. This episode asks a different kind of question. Not why some people lack empathy, not who is evil, but what happens when systems reward emotional detachment? What happens when harm can be justified as efficiency? What happens when outcomes matter more than impact, and conscience becomes optional? Unlike narcissistic dynamics, which often destabilize environments through volatility and exposure, sociopathic and psychopathic strategies can stabilize hierarchies. They can appear calm, rational, effective, and that's precisely why they're so difficult to name. This episode is about power without villains, about influence that doesn't need confusion, chaos, or emotional drama to operate. Influence that works because it's clean, logical, and deniable. There's a reason discussions of sociopathy and psychopathy tend to polarize. On one side, they're sensationalized, turned into horror stories, cinematic archetypes, or simplistic explanations for all harm. On the other hand, they're minimized, dismissed as rare, irrelevant, or too uncomfortable to engage with seriously. Both approaches miss something essential. The most significant harm associated with these patterns doesn't usually happen in isolated personal relationships. It happens in systems, in organizations where outcomes are prioritized over people, in institutions where responsibility is diffused, in structures where decisions are abstracted away from consequences. In those environments, traits like emotional detachment, strategic thinking, and lack of remorse are not punished. They are often rewarded. This episode exists to explore that tension, not to accuse, not to diagnose, but to understand how certain traits interact with power and why some forms of harm feel so impersonal, so rational, and so difficult to challenge. What this episode is, and is not just as in previous episodes, it's important to clarify the boundaries of this conversation. This episode is not about identifying sociopaths or psychopaths in your life. It's not about retroactively labeling people, and it's not about reducing complex human beings to traits or categories. We're not here to decide who someone is. We're here to understand how certain patterns function, especially when systems remove friction, consequence, and accountability. This is also not an episode about inducing fear. If fear were the goal, we'd talk about individuals, pathology, and extremes. Instead, we're talking about structures, incentives, and quiet forms of harm that don't feel dramatic enough to resist until it's too late. And just as importantly, this episode is not about absolving responsibility. Understanding systems does not excuse harm, but misunderstanding systems guarantees their repetition, from validation to leverage. Before we move into the body of this episode, let's briefly orient ourselves in the arc of the series. In episode 2, we explored the narcissistic pattern. We looked at how narcissistic dynamics are organized around supply, admiration, validation, attention, and image maintenance. We saw how these systems often rely on emotional volatility, confusion, and external affirmation to stabilize a fragile internal structure. Narcissistic influence tends to be relationally loud. It pulls attention, it needs mirroring, and it often collapses when exposed. What we're exploring today is different. Sociopathic and psychopathic patterns are not primarily about validation. They're about outcomes. They don't require admiration. They don't require emotional closeness. They don't require others to feel anything at all. Where narcissistic systems seek attention, these systems seek leverage. That distinction matters because it explains why some environments feel emotionally chaotic, while others feel coldly efficient. It explains why some forms of harm are experienced as confusing and destabilizing, while others are experienced as logical, procedural, and strangely difficult to argue against. This episode builds directly on that contrast. So here is the central question we're holding as we move into the episode proper. What happens when influence loses conscience and systems reward harm not because it's cruel, but because it's effective? What happens when decisions are framed as necessary, impact is separated from responsibility, and moral discomfort is dismissed as inefficiency? And perhaps most importantly, why do these dynamics often feel so hard to name, even when the harm is real? These are not abstract questions. They shape workplaces, they shape institutions, they shape governance, culture, and everyday life. They shape how people come to doubt themselves, not because they're confused, but because the system they're in is functioning exactly as designed. As we move into the first section, keep this in mind. This episode is not asking you to decide what you think about sociopathy or psychopathy. It's asking you to observe how power interacts with certain traits and how harm can occur without emotional drama, without obvious malice, and without anyone ever meaning harm. If something resonates, let it resonate. If something doesn't, let it pass. You don't need to agree. You don't need to conclude. You only need to stay present, because clarity doesn't come from certainty. It comes from seeing what's actually there, without looking away, and without turning it into a story too quickly. With that orientation in place, we can begin. Before we go any further, we need to do something that most conversations about sociopathy, psychopathy, and power never do. We need to remove the villains, not because harm doesn't exist, not because damage isn't real, not because some patterns of behavior aren't deeply destructive, but because the moment this topic is framed around monsters, the real mechanisms disappear from view. When we imagine harm as something committed only by obviously cruel, emotionally cold, or visibly bad people, we lose our ability to recognize how often harm emerges from systems that function smoothly, rationally, and with broad social approval. This section is about establishing a different orientation, an orientation that allows us to talk about sociopathy and psychopathy without fear-mongering, without diagnosis, and without the moral theatre that so often replaces understanding. Because the most dangerous forms of influence rarely announce themselves as danger. They present as competence, as decisiveness, as leadership, as realism, and that's where things get difficult. Why this episode requires a different tone. If you've listened to the previous episodes in this series, you'll already feel the shift we're making here. In episode 1, we talked about confusion, how manipulation often destabilizes perception, creates self-doubt, and leaves people questioning their own clarity. In episode 2, we explored the narcissistic pattern, a dynamic organized around validation, image, and attention, often accompanied by emotional volatility and relational noise. But this episode moves into quieter territory, because sociopathic and psychopathic patterns, when paired with power, do not rely on confusion. They often produce the opposite. They produce clarity. Decisions are clean. Logic is coherent. Outcomes are framed as necessary. Emotional complexity is stripped away. This is why so many people struggle to name what feels wrong in these environments. Nothing feels chaotic. Nothing feels dramatic. Nothing feels obviously abusive. Things just work, at least on the surface. So the tone of this episode needs to be different, calmer, more restrained, less emotive, because we're dealing with forms of harm that don't announce themselves emotionally and often don't feel personal at all. The trap of moral simplification. There's a strong cultural pull to simplify this topic. We want to believe that people who cause harm must feel something about it, harmful systems must be driven by malicious intent, and suffering must be traceable to bad actors. This belief is comforting. It reassures us that if we're empathetic, reflective, or well-intentioned, we're on the safe side of the line. But it's also misleading. Many of the most harmful systems in history and in contemporary life were not driven by rage or cruelty. They were driven by efficiency, obedience, abstraction, and the removal of friction between decision and outcome. This is where sociopathic and psychopathic traits become relevant, not as labels for individuals, but as functional strategies that align disturbingly well with hierarchical power. And to see that clearly, we have to step away from moral storytelling, what we mean by power in this episode. Before we go any further, it's important to clarify what we mean by power. We're not talking only about political office or corporate leadership. Power, in this context, means the ability to make decisions that affect others without being directly exposed to the consequences. That can exist in senior management, governance structures, institutional hierarchies, professional authority, cultural influence, or even social roles where one person's decisions outweigh another's voice. Power creates distance. Distance between decision and impact, action and consequence, logic and lived experience. And when that distance exists, certain traits become not just tolerable, but advantageous. This is the uncomfortable truth we're working toward: sociopathy and psychopathy as functional patterns. One of the biggest obstacles to understanding this topic is the way sociopathy and psychopathy are popularly portrayed. They're often reduced to violence, impulsive cruelty, lack of empathy, expressed as overt callousness. But those portrayals miss the point. The traits that matter most in positions of power are not dramatic ones, they're subtle. Traits like emotional detachment, instrumental thinking, comfort with abstraction, low emotional reactivity to harm, and an ability to prioritize outcomes over impact. None of these traits looks dangerous in isolation. In fact, many are actively praised. They're reframed as professionalism, tough decision-making, not taking things personally, being able to separate feelings from facts. This is where the conversation needs precision. Because we're not talking about people who want to harm others. We're talking about people and systems that can cause harm without needing to care either way. And that distinction matters. The difference between cruelty and indifference cruelty is loud. Indifference is quiet. Cruelty draws attention to itself. Indifference hides behind process. Cruelty is emotionally charged. Indifference is emotionally neutral. Most people know how to recognize cruelty. Far fewer people know how to recognize harm that emerges from emotional absence, especially when that absence is framed as objectivity or realism. This is why so many people say things like, "I can't fault the logic, but something feels wrong. The decision makes sense on paper. No one was trying to hurt anyone." Those statements are often true, and they don't negate the harm. This episode is about holding that paradox without collapsing into blame or denial. Why removing villains matters. It might seem counterintuitive, but removing villains from this conversation actually sharpens accountability. When harm is attributed to monsters, it becomes exceptional, rare, external. When harm is understood as emerging from incentives, structures, and rewarded traits, it becomes visible and preventable. This doesn't mean responsibility disappears. It means responsibility becomes distributed appropriately to systems, to cultures, to leadership incentives, and to the norms that reward certain behaviors while silencing others. Villain narratives allow systems to remain untouched. Pattern recognition threatens them. It's also important to name the listener's role here. You are not being asked to identify sociopaths, diagnose leaders, or retrospectively label people in your life. This episode is not a tool for accusation. It's a lens for understanding why some environments feel cold, efficient, and strangely dehumanizing, even when no one appears overtly malicious. If you've ever been in a system where harm was acknowledged but justified, dissent was framed as emotional or unrealistic, and human cost was treated as collateral rather than central, then this episode is for you. Not to validate anger, but to restore clarity. A note on self-recognition. There's another reason we need to remove villains, and it's more personal. If sociopathy and psychopathy are framed as alien traits that only exist out there, we miss an uncomfortable truth. Under pressure, many people can adopt fragments of these strategies. Not because they're broken, not because they're evil, but systems often reward detachment, speed, and decisiveness, especially in moments of crisis. This doesn't mean everyone is a sociopath or psychopath. It means that capacity exists on a spectrum, and growth requires recognizing capacity without turning it into identity. The cost of ignoring conversations such as this, avoiding this topic, doesn't make systems safer. It makes harm harder to name. When we can't talk about emotional detachment without moral panic, we leave a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled by sensationalism, conspiracy, or denial. This series is trying to do something more grounded, to talk about dark patterns without glamour, to talk about power without hysteria, and to talk about harm without losing our humanity in the process. That requires discipline, and that discipline begins here. So before we move into definitions, distinctions, and real-world contexts, let's hold this frame clearly. This episode is about patterns, not people. It's about systems, not monsters. It's about power, not pathology. We are not asking, who is dangerous? We are asking, what becomes dangerous when power removes friction and conscience becomes optional? That question is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. And it's the question that will guide the rest of this episode. With that orientation in place, we can now move forward, carefully, precisely, and without losing sight of what actually matters. From identity to strategy, removing stigma, false certainty, and moral shortcuts. Before we can talk meaningfully about sociopathy and psychopathy, especially in relation to power, we need to dismantle one of the most persistent obstacles to understanding them. That obstacle is identity-based thinking. Most people encounter these terms not through careful research or lived systems analysis, but through cultural shorthand, headlines, documentaries, pop psychology, true crime, or online discourse that treats these words as fixed identities. A sociopath, a psychopath, as if those labels describe what someone is. But that way of thinking is precisely what prevents clarity, because it turns dynamic patterns into static characters. It replaces inquiry with categorization, and it invites moral certainty where humility is required. This section is about making a careful shift, from identity to strategy, from who someone is to how certain traits function, from moral storytelling to structural understanding. Without that shift, everything that follows will be distorted. Why identity labels collapse complexity. Identity labels feel satisfying because they simplify. They allow us to say, that person is dangerous, that person lacks empathy, that person is fundamentally different from me. But simplicity comes at a cost. When we treat sociopathy or psychopathy as identities, three things happen. First, we overestimate certainty. We assume we know what someone is based on limited information, behavior, or impact. Second, we underestimate context. We ignore how environments, incentives, and power structures shape behavior. Third, we externalize capacity. We push these traits out there, preserving a comforting sense of moral distance. This is not only inaccurate, but it's dangerous, because it blinds us to how easily similar strategies can emerge in ordinary people under pressure, responsibility, or threat. Traits are not types. Modern psychological research increasingly reflects this reality. Rather than viewing personality as a set of discrete categories, contemporary models tend to treat traits as dimensional, existing on spectra, varying in intensity, expression, and context. This matters because it shifts the question from, is this person a psychopath? To, which traits are present, under what conditions, and with what effects? That is a fundamentally different inquiry. It allows us to talk about emotional detachment without demonization, impulsivity without caricature, strategic thinking without moral inflation, and it allows us to remain grounded in observation rather than accusation. Sociopathy and psychopathy, functional distinctions. With that framing in place, we can cautiously introduce the distinctions often drawn between sociopathic and psychopathic patterns, not as diagnoses, but as clusters of tendencies that function differently. These distinctions are imperfect, they overlap, and they are frequently misused. But when handled carefully, they help clarify how different strategies of harm operate, especially in relation to power. Sociopathy, reactivity, and opportunism. Sociopathic patterns are often associated with impulsivity, emotional reactivity, difficulty with long-term regulation, opportunistic behavior, and inconsistent attachment. In systems terms, sociopathy tends to be unstable. Decisions may be erratic, reactions may be disproportionate, relationships may fluctuate between engagement and conflict. Harm here is often reactive rather than calculated, emotionally charged rather than detached, visible rather than hidden. Because of this instability, sociopathic strategies often struggle to persist in highly structured, long-term power environments unless buffered by protection, chaos, or externalized responsibility. This doesn't make them harmless, but it does make them easier to detect. Psychopathy, control and calculation. Psychopathic patterns, by contrast, are often associated with emotional detachment, low reactivity, strategic planning, instrumental thinking, and behavioral consistency. This is where things become more subtle and more consequential. Psychopathic strategies are not driven by emotional volatility. They are driven by outcomes. The question is not, how do I feel about this? But, does this work? Harm, when it occurs, is often calculated rather than reactive, justified rather than denied, procedural rather than personal. And because these strategies produce coherence rather than chaos, they can be highly compatible with hierarchical systems. This is the pivot point of the episode. Harm is not always emotional. One of the most important reframes in this series is this: harm does not require emotional cruelty. We are culturally conditioned to equate harm with anger, hostility, sadism, or visible lack of empathy. But many of the most damaging decisions in human history and in everyday institutional life were not made in moments of rage. They were made calmly, rationally, procedurally. This is what makes psychopathic strategies so difficult to confront. There is no emotional lever to pull, no outburst to point to, no cruelty to shame, just logic. And logic, when separated from conscience, can justify almost anything. Strategy over self-image. Another reason identity-based thinking fails is that it assumes people act in alignment with their self-image. But strategies do not require self-awareness. A person can see themselves as reasonable, believe they are acting responsibly, and sincerely think they are doing the necessary thing while still participating in harm. This is especially true in systems where responsibility is distributed, outcomes are abstracted, and emotional feedback is muted. The strategy functions regardless of how the person understands themselves. This is why focusing on impact rather than intent is so critical. The role of power in strategy selection strategies don't emerge in a vacuum. They are shaped and rewarded by context. In environments where decisiveness is valued over deliberation, speed is prioritized over reflection, outcomes matter more than process, and accountability is diffuse, strategies associated with emotional detachment and instrumental thinking become advantageous, not because someone is psychopathic, but because the system selects for those traits. This is how power interacts with personality. It's why reframing these terms as strategies, rather than identities, allows us to see how harm becomes normalized, why moral language gets in the way. When we moralize these patterns too quickly, we lose sight of something crucial. Moral outrage feels clarifying, but it often short-circuits understanding. If we say, this is evil, or this person lacks humanity, we may feel grounded, but we've stopped asking, how did this happen? What conditions made this possible? What incentives maintained it? Those questions are uncomfortable because they implicate systems we rely on. But without them, we're left with blame and no leverage. Strategy does not equal destiny. Reframing sociopathy and psychopathy as strategies also protects us from another trap: determinism. Traits are not destiny. A person may exhibit emotional detachment under pressure and empathy in other contexts. A system may reward calculation in one domain and punish it in another. By focusing on strategy, we preserve the possibility of change, the role of accountability, and the space for growth. We also avoid turning these concepts into identity prisons for others or ourselves. Why this matters personally. Even if you never hold formal power, you exist within systems shaped by it. Workplaces, institutions, cultures. Understanding how strategies function helps you. Recognize when harm is being justified as a necessity, identify when logic is being used to bypass conscience, and resist internalizing blame for outcomes you didn't control. This is not about becoming suspicious. It's about becoming literate. So as we move into the next section, where we'll explore how power amplifies these strategies, keep this orientation steady. We are not naming people. We are not diagnosing. We are not declaring moral superiority. We are observing how certain traits behave when power removes friction. And we are doing so without losing sight of our shared humanity. That balance matters, because the moment we turn understanding into condemnation, we reproduce the very dynamics we're trying to expose. Section 3, Power Changes Everything. How traits become tools and harm becomes functional. Up to this point, we've been careful to remove moral shortcuts. We've stepped away from identity labels. We've resisted the urge to pathologize. And we've reframed sociopathy and psychopathy not as types of people, but as clusters of strategies, patterns of behavior that function differently depending on context. Now we arrive at the inflection point of the episode. Traits do not exist in isolation. They exist inside systems. And when power enters the equation, everything changes. Power is not a trait. It's an environment. One of the most common misunderstandings about power is that it belongs to individuals. We talk about powerful people as if power is something they possess internally, a quality of character, charisma, intelligence, or dominance. But power is not primarily psychological. It is structural. Power exists wherever someone can make decisions that affect others without being directly exposed to the consequences and without needing consent from those affected. That distance between decision and impact is the defining feature of power. And once that distance exists, certain strategies stop being costly. They become efficient. Power reduces friction, and friction is where conscience lives. In ordinary life, most people regulate their behavior through feedback. If you hurt someone, you see it. If you act callously, you feel the relational cost. If you make a poor decision, consequences arrive quickly. That friction keeps empathy active. Power removes friction. When decisions are abstracted, filtered through layers of policy, procedure, delegation, or institutional language, emotional feedback weakens. You don't see the person affected. You see a metric, a report, a number, a case. This is not inherently malicious. It's how complex systems function. But it creates a vacuum. And that vacuum is where certain traits flourish. When emotional detachment becomes an advantage, in environments where outcomes matter more than experience, emotional detachment stops being a liability. It becomes an asset. Consider what happens when decisions must be made quickly, dissent slows progress, emotional complexity is seen as inefficiency, and accountability is distributed across teams or departments. In these contexts, someone who doesn't feel conflicted, doesn't hesitate, doesn't ruminate on impact, and doesn't require emotional resolution will appear competent, decisive, reliable, strong. This is not because they are wiser. It's because the system rewards low internal friction. And psychopathic strategies, emotional detachment, instrumental thinking, and behavioral consistency produce exactly that. One of the most unsettling aspects of power is how it relabels traits. What looks concerning in intimate relationships often looks admirable in hierarchical systems. For example, emotional detachment becomes professionalism. Lack of remorse becomes tough leadership. Strategic deception becomes political skill. Charm without attachment becomes charisma. Indifference to dissent becomes focus. None of these labels is inherently false, but they obscure the cost. They reframe behavior in ways that detach it from human impact. And once reframed, those behaviors become normative, expected, even aspirational. Why these systems feel so hard to challenge. One of the most disorienting experiences people report in power-heavy environments is this. Everything makes sense, and yet something feels wrong. Decisions are logical. Processes are followed. Justifications are coherent. And because nothing overtly abusive is happening, resistance feels irrational. You're not arguing against cruelty. You're arguing against logic. This is where power-based harm becomes so difficult to confront. There's no emotional rupture to point to, no outburst to cite, no villain to oppose. Just a system functioning as designed. Power and the absence of emotional noise. This is a crucial distinction from earlier episodes. Narcissistic systems are noisy. They generate confusion, volatility, emotional drama, and relational instability. They rely on attention and reaction. Power-driven psychopathic systems are quiet. They generate clarity. They stabilize hierarchy. They minimize emotional disturbance. People often report that these environments feel cold, sterile, procedural, sound strangely calm. And that calm can be deeply seductive, especially for people who value order, responsibility, or competence. But calm is not the same as care, and clarity is not the same as conscience. Harm without hostility. One of the most important things to understand about power-driven harm is that it often occurs without hostility. No one is angry, no one is cruel, no one is even particularly invested. The harm emerges because decisions are made at scale, people are abstracted into roles or categories, and responsibility is diffused. This is why people often struggle to describe what happened to them. They weren't attacked, they weren't abused, they were processed. And processing feels neutral until you're on the receiving end. The illusion of necessity power loves necessity. Necessity dissolves resistance. When harm is framed as unavoidable, dissent becomes emotional rather than ethical. You hear phrases like, there was no alternative. This was the only viable option. We had to make a hard decision. The bigger picture required it. These statements are often true in a narrow sense, but they also function as moral aesthetics. They dull the discomfort that might otherwise slow the system down. And once necessity becomes the dominant narrative, conscience becomes negotiable. Why accountability evaporates upward. Another defining feature of power-based systems is the way accountability thins as you move upward. At the bottom, people experience direct impact, emotional cost is immediate, and harm is personal. At the top, impact is aggregated, responsibility is shared, and emotional feedback is minimal. This creates a gradient where harm increases while felt responsibility decreases. And within that gradient, strategies that minimize internal conflict are rewarded. Not because they're right, but because they're functional. Power does not create these traits, it selects them. It's important to be precise here. Power does not magically turn people into sociopaths or psychopaths. What it does is select for certain traits. People who feel less internal conflict, tolerate abstraction more easily, and can prioritize outcomes over impact are more likely to rise and remain in positions of power. Others burn out, withdraw, self-doubt, or leave. Over time, this creates an environment where certain strategies become dominant, not because they're ethical, but because they're sustainable within the structure. This is how systems drift, not through conspiracy, but through selection. The listener's dilemma inside power systems. If you've ever been inside such a system, you may recognize a particular internal conflict. On one hand, you understand the logic, you see the constraints, and you recognize the complexity. On the other, something feels off, human cost feels minimized, and emotional responses are subtly invalidated. This puts you in a bind. If you object, you sound naive. If you comply, you feel complicit. This is not a personal failure. It's the psychological cost of existing inside systems where conscience has been externalized. Why power rewards emotional minimalism. There's a reason emotional minimalism rises with power. Emotion slows things down. It introduces uncertainty. It demands reflection. It complicates decisions. From a systems perspective, emotion is friction, and systems built around efficiency tend to eliminate friction wherever possible. This doesn't make those systems evil, but it does make them inhospitable to humanity, and that's the cost we're naming here. When strategy becomes culture over time, strategies harden into norms. Newcomers learn quickly what is rewarded, what is tolerated, and what is quietly sidelined. People adapt, they stop raising concerns, they rationalize decisions, they learn the language of necessity. Not because they've lost their values, but because the system trains them to separate values from outcomes. This is how harm becomes ordinary, the subtle erosion of moral agency. One of the most damaging effects of power-driven systems is not the harm they cause directly, it's the way they erode moral agency. When decisions are framed as inevitable, individuals stop seeing themselves as agents. They become functionaries. They say, that's just how it works. I didn't have a choice. It wasn't my call. And sometimes that's true, but repeated often enough, it becomes an identity, one where conscience is outsourced upward and responsibility dissolves sideways. Power without villains. This brings us back to where we began. The danger is not that some people are monsters. The danger is that we build systems where monsters aren't required, cruelty isn't necessary, and harm can proceed smoothly, calmly, and legally. This is the reality we're examining, not to induce despair, but to restore clarity. As we move into the next section, we're going to make a crucial contrast, because not all harmful systems feel calm. Some feel chaotic, some feel confused, some feel emotionally volatile. Understanding the difference between those dynamics and what they signal is key. Next, we'll explore how narcissistic supply differs from instrumental control, and why that distinction matters for recognizing power-based harm. Section 4. The difference between narcissistic supply and instrumental control, why some systems collapse under exposure and others persist quietly. To understand power-driven harm, we need to make a distinction that is often blurred, sometimes deliberately. Not all manipulative or harmful dynamics operate in the same way. Not all systems destabilize perception through confusion, and not all forms of control rely on emotional intensity. This section exists to draw a clean line between two patterns that are frequently conflated: narcissistic supply and instrumental control. Both can cause damage, both can distort relationships and systems, but they function very differently, and recognizing that difference is essential if we want to understand why some environments feel chaotic and volatile, while others feel cold, coherent, and almost impossible to challenge. Why this distinction matters: many people come to this work through experiences that were emotionally destabilizing. They remember confusion, volatility, hot and cold dynamics, sudden shifts in tone, and emotional hooks that kept them engaged. Those experiences align closely with narcissistic dynamics. But when people encounter power-based systems organized around instrumental control, something different happens. They often say, nothing felt dramatic. There was no emotional abuse. I can't fault the logic. It all made sense at the time, and yet the harm was real. Without this distinction, people either underestimate harm because it wasn't emotional, or overapply narcissistic frameworks to systems that don't operate that way. Both lead to confusion. Narcissistic supply, regulation through attention. Narcissistic dynamics are organized around supply. Supply can take many forms: admiration, validation, attention, emotional reaction, or even opposition. What matters is not whether the attention is positive or negative, but that it exists. At the core of narcissistic supply is external regulation. The narcissistic pattern depends on others to stabilize self-worth, reflect identity, and maintain a coherent self-image. This creates a relational loop. Attention flows in, reaction flows out. Volatility keeps the system alive. Emotional noise as a signal. One of the defining features of narcissistic systems is emotional noise. There is intensity, unpredictability, shifting narratives, sudden reversals, and a constant demand for engagement. People inside these systems often feel confused, off balance, emotionally drained, and hyper-attuned to mood shifts. This is not accidental. Confusion keeps attention locked in. Emotional volatility prevents reflection. Noise substitutes for intimacy. And because attention is the currency, exposure is dangerous. When narcissistic systems are clearly named, mirrored, or deprived of supply, they often destabilize or collapse. They cannot function without engagement. Narcissistic power is fragile. Even when narcissistic individuals or dynamics hold formal power, that power tends to be unstable. It relies on image management, impression control, loyalty displays, and emotional reinforcement. Challenges are experienced as threats. Criticism is personalized. Dissent feels like an attack. This makes narcissistic systems reactive. They burn energy managing perception rather than executing strategy. And because of this fragility, they are often visible. People feel something is wrong. Instrumental control. Regulation through outcomes. Instrumental control operates differently. It does not seek validation. It does not require attention. And it does not depend on emotional engagement. Its primary question is not, how am I seen? But what works? This is where sociopathic and psychopathic strategies become relevant, not as identities, but as functional orientations. Instrumental control is organized around leverage, efficiency, predictability, and outcome optimization. Emotion is not the fuel. Outcomes are. The absence of emotional noise. One of the most striking differences between these two patterns is the absence of emotional noise in instrumental systems. There is consistency, coherence, procedural logic, and calm execution. People inside these systems often describe them as professional, rational, orderly, and even reassuring. This is why instrumental harm is so difficult to name. There's nothing to point to emotionally. No drama, no volatility, no obvious abuse. Just process. Why exposure doesn't work here. Strategies that destabilize narcissistic systems often fail against instrumental control. Naming harm doesn't provoke a reaction. Appealing to empathy doesn't land. Calling out inconsistency doesn't destabilize the structure, because the system is not organized around self-image. It is organized around results. As long as outcomes are achieved and the system remains intact, exposure changes nothing. This is why people often feel gaslit by logic rather than emotion. They aren't told they're wrong. They're told the decision was necessary. The process was followed. There were constraints, which may all be true and still harmful. Validation versus leverage. At the heart, this distinction is a simple contrast. Narcissism needs validation. Instrumental control needs leverage. Validation is relational. Leverage is structural. Validation depends on people caring. Leverage depends on people needing something. A job, access, approval, belonging, stability. When leverage exists, emotional engagement is optional. How leverage silences dissent. Instrumental systems don't need to suppress dissent aggressively. They make dissent impractical. People learn that raising concerns changes nothing, emotional arguments are dismissed as irrelevant, and ethical objections are reframed as operational obstacles. Over time, people self-regulate. They stop speaking, not because they're afraid, but because it feels futile. This is a very different psychological experience from narcissistic suppression. There is no fear of retaliation, there is resignation. Chaos versus coherence. Another way to understand this distinction is through the lens of chaos versus coherence. Narcissistic systems generate chaos, destabilize relationships, and rely on emotional turbulence. Instrumental systems generate coherence, stabilize hierarchy, and rely on predictability. Chaos draws attention, coherence hides harm. And in large systems, coherence is often mistaken for health. Why instrumental systems feel safe. People often describe instrumental systems as mature, realistic, and pragmatic. They contrast them with emotionally charged environments and feel relieved. Finally, something that makes sense. But sense-making is not the same as ethical grounding. A system can be perfectly logical and still violate human dignity. This is one of the most difficult insights to integrate. How harm is justified differently. Narcissistic harm is often denied. Instrumental harm is justified. That difference is crucial. In narcissistic systems, harm is reframed, responsibility is deflected, and narratives shift. In instrumental systems, harm is acknowledged, but framed as unavoidable or necessary for a greater good. This creates a different kind of psychological injury. People don't doubt what happened. They doubt whether they're allowed to object. The moral inversion. Instrumental control often inverts moral language. Compassion becomes inefficiency. Empathy becomes bias. Reflection becomes delayed. Resistance becomes immaturity. People are not told they're wrong. They're told they're unrealistic. This is how systems silence ethics without ever attacking them directly. Why these systems persist quietly. Narcissistic systems often implode. Instrumental systems persist. They persist because they scale, they self-reinforce, and they don't depend on any single personality. Even if one individual leaves, the structure remains. This is why people often feel powerless. They can leave, but the system continues. This distinction helps explain a common experience. People leave emotionally volatile environments feeling shaken, confused, and raw. People leave instrumental environments feeling numb, resigned, or strangely guilty. They often ask, why didn't I speak up? Why did I go along with it? Why does it still feel wrong, even though it made sense? The answer is not weakness, it's context. Why both patterns are dangerous. Differently, it's tempting to rank these patterns, to decide which is worse. That's a mistake. Narcissistic systems damage through emotional destabilization, consume attention, and erode self-trust. Instrumental systems damage through abstraction, normalize harm, and erode moral agency. One wounds the psyche, the other wounds the conscience. Both matter. Holding this without moral inflation. As we hold this distinction, it's vital not to turn it into a hierarchy of evil. This is not about saying narcissism is immature, psychopathy is evil, or one is more dangerous than the other. It's about recognizing different mechanisms and responding appropriately. Calling out narcissism with exposure may work. Calling out instrumental control requires structural change. Without that distinction, people exhaust themselves fighting the wrong battle. In the next section, we'll explore where these instrumental patterns are most likely to thrive. Not in dramatic interpersonal conflicts, but in corporate environments, governance structures, and institutional hierarchies. We'll look at how these strategies scale and why harm often feels impersonal, procedural, and impossible to locate. Section 5, real-world contexts where these patterns thrive, how instrumental control scales, and why harm becomes impersonal, procedural, and hard to locate. Up to this point, we've been building a conceptual map. We've separated identity from strategy. We've shown how power reduces friction. We've distinguished narcissistic supply from instrumental control. Now we need to ground all of that in lived reality, not through personal anecdotes, but through contexts, because these patterns don't float in abstraction. They embed themselves in environments with particular incentives, pressures, and blind spots. This section is about where instrumental strategies thrive, why they persist, and how ordinary people become caught inside systems that cause harm without ever feeling cruel. No villains, no diagnosis, no sensationalism, just structures. Why context matters more than character. A recurring mistake in discussions of power is the assumption that outcomes are driven primarily by who is in charge. Replace the leader, the thinking goes, and the problem will resolve. Sometimes that's true, but often it isn't, because many environments are strategy selective. They reward certain behaviors and quietly penalize others, regardless of who occupies a role. Over time, people adapt, not because they've changed their values, but because survival, progression, and legitimacy depend on alignment with the system's logic. This is why focusing on context is not avoidance. It's precision. 1. Corporate and institutional power, metrics over morality. Modern organizations often operate under intense pressure to demonstrate performance. Revenue, efficiency, growth, compliance, risk mitigation. These demands are not inherently unethical, but they create a landscape where what can be measured begins to matter more than what can be felt. Human cost rarely fits neatly into dashboards, so it becomes secondary, the quiet ascendancy of instrumental traits. In many corporate environments, people who rise are not necessarily the most empathetic, but the most functional within the system. They tolerate abstraction, make decisions without rumination, separate emotion from outcome, and remain composed under pressure. These traits are celebrated. They are reframed as resilience, decisiveness, professionalism, and executive presence. What goes unnoticed is the trade-off. As emotional feedback diminishes, so does moral friction. Decisions feel cleaner, execution becomes smoother, and harm becomes easier to justify. When policy replaces judgment, one of the most common features of instrumental control in organizations is the over-reliance on policy. Policies are meant to create fairness, but they can also create distance. When decisions are justified by policy, personal accountability weakens, discretion is discouraged, and ethical nuance is flattened. People say, "My hands are tied." That's the policy. We followed procedure. And often they did. But policy following can become a way to outsource conscience. This is how systems produce harm without malice, and without anyone feeling personally responsible. Plausible deniability as organizational culture. In many institutions, harm is not denied, it is diffused. Responsibility is spread across committees, approval chains, legal frameworks, and risk assessments. Each step makes sense, but taken together, they create an environment where no one feels authorized to intervene ethically. The system remains intact, the outcome persists, and individuals are left holding the impact. 2. Organizational hierarchies, upward charm, downward pressure hierarchies intensify instrumental strategies because they create asymmetry. Those at the top experience abstraction. Those at the bottom experience consequences. This asymmetry shapes behavior. Managing up, managing down in hierarchical systems, people often learn two different languages. Upward, polished, confident, strategic, and emotionally contained. Downward, directive, procedural, outcome-focused, and emotionally distant. This split is not necessarily conscious. It emerges because upward movement depends on appearing competent and untroubled, while downward management prioritizes execution. Over time, empathy flows upward as impression management, not downward as care. The role of delegated harm instrumental systems often rely on proxy harm. Decisions that cause damage are executed by others. Managers implement policies they didn't design, HR enforces decisions framed as neutral, and teams carry out restructures decided elsewhere. This creates a moral buffer. People can say, "I didn't decide this. I'm just doing my job. I don't have the authority to change it." And again, they may be right, but the cumulative effect is a system where harm proceeds smoothly without anyone feeling responsible for stopping it. 3. Politics and governance. Performative empathy versus operational harm. Political systems provide one of the clearest examples of instrumental control. Public narratives emphasize care, values, and empathy. Operational decisions prioritize strategy, power, and outcome. This split is not accidental, it's structural. Emotional language as cover in governance. Emotional language often functions symbolically. Statements of concern, expressions of solidarity, acknowledgements of impact. These gestures serve a purpose. They stabilize legitimacy, but legitimacy does not require structural change. So emotional signaling can coexist with, or even obscure operational harm. The public sees empathy. The system executes the strategy. Both can be true. Strategic lying without emotional investment. One of the most unsettling features of instrumental power is the ability to lie without emotional charge. Not out of malice, out of calculation. Information is framed, Narratives are shaped. Timing is managed. The goal is not to deceive for pleasure, but to maintain control. And because the deception is instrumental rather than emotional, it doesn't produce the signs we associate with dishonesty. No guilt, no defensiveness, no volatility, just coherence. 4. Bureaucracy and process-driven systems. When procedure becomes authority, bureaucratic systems are particularly fertile ground for instrumental control. They prioritize standardization, predictability, and scalability. These are not inherently bad, but when procedure becomes the primary source of legitimacy, human judgment is sidelined. The dehumanization of casework. In many bureaucratic contexts, people are transformed into cases, files, numbers, categories. This abstraction is necessary for scale, but it also strips away individuality. Decisions are made based on eligibility criteria, thresholds, and compliance markers. Impact becomes secondary. People experiencing harm often say, "No one listened. I kept being passed along. There was no one to appeal to." Not because anyone was cruel, but because the system was not designed to hold conscience. The illusion of neutrality. Procedural systems often present themselves as neutral. Rules apply equally. Decisions are standardized. Outcomes are consistent. But neutrality is not the same as justice. Uniform application can ignore unequal impact. And when people raise this, they are often told, "That's just how the system works." This phrase is one of the most powerful silencers in institutional life. 5. Professional cultures. When detachment is taught, certain professions explicitly train emotional detachment. Law, finance, medicine, security, risk management. Again, this detachment serves a function. It allows people to perform under pressure. But when detachment becomes identity rather than a tool, it can slide into instrumental indifference. Emotional suppression as competence. In many professional cultures, emotional expression is subtly penalized. Concern is reframed as weakness, hesitation as incompetence, ethical discomfort as immaturity. People learn to suppress signals. Over time, they stop noticing them, not because they don't care, but because caring disrupts performance. This is how conscience atrophies quietly. 6. Crisis environments. The justification of harm through urgency crises accelerate instrumental strategies. When urgency dominates, speed overrides reflection, necessity overrides consent, and harm is reframed as collateral. People say there was no time. We had to act. Lives were at stake. Sometimes that's true. But crisis logic has a way of persisting beyond the crisis itself. Emergency measures become norms. Temporary harms become permanent structures. And those who question them are framed as irresponsible. 7. Why these contexts feel so hard to leave. One of the most confusing aspects of instrumental systems is the emotional residue they leave behind. People don't always feel traumatized. They feel numb, resigned, morally dulled, or quietly complicit. They struggle to articulate what was wrong, because nothing dramatic happened, just a gradual erosion of agency. The subtle moral injury. What these systems often produce is not emotional trauma, but moral injury. A sense that something you value was compromised, your voice didn't matter, or your ethics were sidelined. Moral injury doesn't scream, it whispers. And it's one of the most under-recognized consequences of instrumental power. 8. Why good people stay. A crucial point needs to be made here. People don't stay in these systems because they lack integrity. They stay because they need stability. They believe change is possible. They don't want to abandon colleagues, or they hope their presence mitigates harm. This is not a weakness, it's humanity. And instrumental systems often exploit that humanity by rewarding silence and punishing friction. 9. Recognizing the pattern without paranoia. At this point, it's important to restate something clearly. Not every hierarchy is harmful. Not every organization is cold. Not every use of logic is manipulative. The difference lies in what the system does with dissent, emotion, and conscience. When harm is acknowledged but justified, ethics are reframed as inefficiency, and emotional signals are consistently dismissed, you are likely in an instrumental system that prioritizes outcome over impact. That recognition is not paranoia, it's literacy. This section has been about visibility, about seeing how strategies scale, how harm becomes procedural, and how systems persist without villains. In the next section, we'll return inward, not to personalize blame, but to explore a subtle signal that often distinguishes instrumental harm from narcissistic dynamics: the absence of confusion, why clarity itself can sometimes be the warning sign. Section 6, the absence of confusion, a key signal, why clarity itself can be the warning sign and how conscience quietly disappears. There's a moment many people expect when something is wrong: a rupture, an argument, a spike of fear, a sense of emotional chaos that signals danger. But when it comes to instrumental systems, particularly those shaped by sociopathic or psychopathic strategies, that moment often never arrives. Instead, people report something far more unsettling. Everything makes sense, the decisions are coherent, the reasoning is sound, the explanations are consistent, and yet something essential is missing. This section is about that absence, not of logic, but of confusion, and why its disappearance can be one of the clearest signals that conscience has been quietly removed from the equation. Why we expect confusion and why it misleads us. Most people associate manipulation with disorientation. They expect contradictions, emotional volatility, shifting narratives, and a sense of being pulled in opposing directions. And in many cases, that expectation is correct. Narcissistic systems often generate confusion precisely because confusion keeps people engaged. It destabilizes internal reference points and keeps attention locked in. But instrumental systems don't need confusion. They don't rely on emotional engagement. They don't require you to doubt your sanity. They don't need to destabilize your perception. They operate through coherence, which is why so many people fail to recognize harm until long after it's occurred. Clarity as a tool of control. Clarity feels safe. It reduces anxiety. It creates predictability. It signals competence. When someone or some system can explain itself clearly, calmly, and consistently, it earns trust almost automatically. We associate clarity with truth, maturity, and reliability. And most of the time, that association is valid. But clarity can also be instrumental. It can function not to illuminate reality, but to stabilize compliance. The difference between understanding and consent. One of the most subtle manipulations in instrumental systems is the conflation of understanding with consent. You'll walk through the logic. You're shown the constraints. You're told why alternatives aren't viable. You may even agree that the reasoning is sound. But agreement with logic is not the same as agreement with impact. Understanding why harm occurred does not mean you've consented to it. And yet, in many systems, once you understand the reasoning, the objection is reframed as emotional or irrational. This is how clarity becomes a silencer. When logic replaces ethics, ethics are slow. They require reflection. They tolerate ambiguity. They force us to sit in discomfort. Logic, by contrast, is fast. It moves cleanly from premise to conclusion. It resolves tension. It produces answers. In instrumental systems, logic often replaces ethics, not because ethics are rejected, but because they're seen as inefficient. People begin to ask, does this work? Instead of, is this right? And once that shift occurs, harm no longer needs justification through denial. It only needs explanation. The experience of it all made sense. People who exit instrumental systems often struggle to articulate what happened to them. They say things like, I can't fault the reasoning. No one lied to me. I understood the decision. And then, often quietly, but something about it still feels wrong. This internal split is profoundly destabilizing, because when harm occurs without confusion, the mind turns inward. If the logic was sound, if the process was followed, if the explanation was coherent, then the question becomes, what's wrong with me? This is how instrumental harm produces self-doubt without gaslighting. Why instrumental harm rarely feels personal. Another reason clarity is so disarming is that instrumental harm often doesn't feel personal. No one is angry at you. No one targets you emotionally. No one expresses hostility. You're not singled out. You're included in a category, a role, a function, a case. This impersonality creates emotional distance, and that distance makes it harder to mobilize resistance, because resistance is usually driven by feeling personally wronged. When harm feels procedural, protest feels misplaced. The quiet seduction of being reasonable. Many people pride themselves on being reasonable. They value rationality, fairness, and emotional restraint. Instrumental systems exploit this. They reward those who accept explanations, suppress emotional responses, and prioritize coherence over discomfort. Over time, people begin to equate emotional reaction with immaturity. They tell themselves, I don't want to be dramatic. I understand the constraints. This is just how things work. This self-regulation is not imposed. It's internalized. This is where we need to pause and turn the lens gently inward, not to personalize blame, but to recognize capacity. What's unsettling about instrumental systems is not that they are driven by inhuman people. It's that many of us can recognize the outline of these strategies in ourselves under certain conditions, under pressure, under responsibility, under threat of loss or failure. There are moments when clarity feels preferable to care, when outcomes feel more important than impact, when emotional distance feels not cruel, but responsible. This doesn't make someone sociopathic or psychopathic. It makes them human inside systems that reward those orientations. Recognizing this capacity is not an accusation. It's a safeguard, because the danger lies not in having the capacity, but in never noticing when it's being activated. When calm becomes complicity, one of the most insidious aspects of instrumental clarity is how calm it feels. There's no internal alarm, no emotional turbulence, no obvious stress response. Everything is organized, and that calm can be mistaken for integrity. But calm without conscience is not neutrality. It's alignment with the system's priorities. This is how people become complicit without intending to be. Not through malice, through coherence. The absence of confusion as a diagnostic signal. At this point, it's important to name something clearly. Confusion is not always a sign of manipulation, but the total absence of confusion in the presence of harm should give us pause. When decisions are consistently logical, impact is consistently justified, and ethical discomfort is consistently reframed as impractical, we are likely dealing with an instrumental system where conscience has been externalized. This is not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. How this differs from healthy clarity: not all clarity is dangerous. Healthy clarity allows for dissent, invites ethical questioning, and tolerates emotional complexity. Instrumental clarity shuts down objection, frames ethics as obstacles, and treats emotion as noise. The difference is not in how clear the explanation is, but in what happens when you raise a concern. Are concerns engaged with or managed away? Why smart, ethical people get trapped here? Instrumental systems often attract intelligent, conscientious people. People who want to understand, value logic, and take responsibility seriously. These qualities make them especially vulnerable, because when clarity is offered, they accept it. When explanations are given, they listen. When harm is framed as necessary, they wrestle internally and often conclude that the problem must be their own discomfort. This is how systems co-opt virtue. The subtle collapse of internal reference points over time, repeated exposure to instrumental clarity can erode internal reference points. You stop asking, how does this feel? Does this align with my values? And start asking, is this consistent with the system? Is this how things are done? This shift is gradual, and because it's gradual, it's rarely noticed until something breaks. When leaving feels harder than staying, people often stay in these systems longer than they want to, not because they're trapped, but because leaving feels unjustified. After all, nothing dramatic happened, no one was overtly harmed, and the reasoning was sound. This creates a strange paralysis. You can't point to abuse, you can't articulate betrayal, you can't even fully explain your discomfort. You just know that something essential has been traded away. Moral injury without emotional trauma. This is where we need to introduce a subtle but important distinction. Instrumental systems often produce moral injury, not emotional trauma. Moral injury occurs when your values are compromised, your ethical voice is sidelined, or you participate in harm you understand but cannot prevent. It doesn't manifest as panic or fear. It manifests as numbness, resignation, quiet self-betrayal, and because it lacks emotional intensity, it's easy to overlook. Why instrumental harm persists? Undetected instrumental harm persists because it doesn't violate expectations. People expect harm to feel bad, to feel chaotic, to feel unsafe. When harm feels calm, rational, and justified, it bypasses our warning systems. This is why clarity itself becomes the signal. Not clarity alone, but clarity paired with ethical foreclosure. Relearning to trust discomfort. One of the most important recoveries from instrumental harm is learning to trust discomfort again. Not emotional reactivity, but quiet, persistent misalignment. The sense that something is being prioritized over something else, impact is being minimized, or conscience is being treated as optional. This discomfort doesn't demand action, it asks for attention. In the sections that follow, we'll explore how empathy itself can be weaponized, how collective harm occurs without personal cruelty, and how people begin to rebuild internal orientation after exposure to these dynamics. But for now, this is the core insight to hold. When harm is happening and nothing feels confusing, chaotic, or emotionally charged, clarity itself may be the warning sign. This isn't about seeing danger everywhere. It's about recognizing the moments when everything makes sense and you quietly disappear. Section 7: Empathy as a tool, not a bond. Why understanding emotions doesn't guarantee care, and how sensitivity can be weaponized. Empathy is one of the most celebrated human capacities. We're taught to see it as a moral good, a marker of safety, and a reliable signal of trustworthiness. To be empathic is to be humane. To lack empathy is to be dangerous. Most of the time that framing works. But in systems shaped by instrumental control, empathy can take on a different function, not as a bridge between people, but as a tool. Not as a bond, but as a means of prediction. This section is about disentangling empathy from benevolence and understanding how emotional insight can be used without emotional care. Empathy is not a singular component. One of the biggest misconceptions in popular discourse is that empathy is a unitary trait. In reality, empathy has distinct components: affective empathy, feeling with someone, emotional resonance; cognitive empathy, understanding what someone feels; perspective taking, compassionate response, choosing to care, acting with concern. These components often co-occur, but they don't have to. And when they split, things get complicated. Cognitive empathy. Without effective resonance, instrumental systems tend to privilege cognitive empathy. Why? Because cognitive empathy allows prediction without vulnerability. If you can accurately read motivations, fears, values, and likely reactions, you can influence behavior without needing to feel anything yourself. This is not inherently malicious. Doctors, negotiators, and leaders use cognitive empathy every day. But when cognitive empathy is decoupled from effective resonance and compassion, it becomes strategic. It answers questions like, what will move this person? What will keep them compliant? What language will stabilize them? Not, what is happening to them? What does this cost them? How do we minimize harm? Empathy as prediction, not care in instrumental environments. Empathy often functions as prediction. Understanding emotions becomes a way to anticipate resistance, manage dissent, and smooth execution. This is why people sometimes describe these systems as, they understood me perfectly. They knew exactly what to say. They seemed so attuned, but nothing changed. Attunement without care is not connection. It's calibration. Emotional mimicry as camouflage. Another feature of instrumental empathy is emotional mimicry. This is not deception in the dramatic sense. It's alignment, mirroring tone, using the right emotional language, reflecting values accurately. From the outside, this looks like understanding. But because it's not grounded in effective resonance, it doesn't generate restraint. There is no internal friction when harm occurs because nothing is felt. This is why people often say, they sounded compassionate, they acknowledged my feelings, they said all the right things, and still experienced harm. Why empathy gets moralized culturally, we moralize empathy. We treat it as proof of goodness. So when someone displays emotional intelligence, articulate feelings, attuned to nuance, mirror vulnerability, we infer safety. This inference is usually adaptive, but it becomes a blind spot in instrumental systems. Because empathy can be displayed without commitment. Sensitivity does not equal care. Insight does not equal protection. The weaponization of kind language instrumental empathy often shows up linguistically. Phrases like, I hear you, I understand how this feels. This isn't easy for anyone. We don't take this lightly. These statements may be sincere in tone, but sincerity of tone does not guarantee sincerity of outcome. When language is used to regulate emotion rather than change conditions, it becomes a tool of control. It soothes without altering reality. The subtle collapse of agency. One of the quiet effects of instrumental empathy is the collapse of agency. When someone feels understood, they often relax. They stop pushing. They stop objecting. They feel seen. But if understanding is not paired with action, agency dissolves. You feel acknowledged but unchanged. This is particularly destabilizing because it contradicts a deep social script. If someone understands me, they will care. When that script fails, people often turn inward rather than outward. They doubt their needs. Why emotional intelligence is not a safeguard. Emotional intelligence is often framed as a corrective to power abuse. Teach leaders empathy, the thinking goes, and harm will diminish. But emotional intelligence without ethical anchoring can increase harm. Because it improves persuasion, refines influence, and reduces visible resistance. This is not an argument against emotional intelligence. It's an argument against treating it as a moral shield. Empathy in hierarchical contexts. In hierarchies, empathy often flows upwards symbolically and downward strategically. Leaders learn to speak the language of care. Systems adopt compassionate narratives. Organizations publish value statements. Meanwhile, decisions remain unchanged. This creates a split between relational tone and structural reality. People feel listened to, but remain powerless. When empathy masks asymmetry, one of the most dangerous effects of instrumental empathy is that it masks power asymmetry. When someone in authority speaks empathetically, it can create the illusion of equality. You feel met, you feel heard, you feel respected, but the power differential remains. And because the interaction feels relational, you may underestimate the structural imbalance. This makes resistance harder, not easier. Many people report a specific confusion around empathy in power systems. They say, they understood me, so why didn't anything change? They validated my feelings, but the outcome stayed the same. I felt cared for, but also harmed. This is not a contradiction. It's instrumental empathy doing its job. Empathy is a boundary, not a virtue. One of the reframes this series invites is this. Empathy is not a virtue in itself. It is a capacity. What matters is how it's used, whether it's paired with responsibility, and whether it constrains harm. Empathy without accountability can facilitate harm more efficiently than indifference because it reduces resistance. Why this matters for recognition. Understanding this distinction helps restore internal orientation. When you notice empathy that soothes but doesn't change outcomes, understanding that doesn't shift conditions, attunement that precedes harm, you're not witnessing care, you're witnessing a strategy. That recognition doesn't require confrontation. It requires clarity. Holding empathy without idealizing it. This section is not about rejecting empathy. It's about holding it accurately. Empathy can heal. Empathy can connect. Empathy can also control. The difference lies not in how it feels, but in what follows. In the next section, we'll examine how these dynamics scale beyond individuals, how collective harm occurs without personal cruelty, and why so many people participate in damaging systems without ever intending to cause harm. For now, hold this gently. Understanding emotions does not guarantee care. Sensitivity does not guarantee safety. And empathy, when unmoored from conscience, can become a powerful tool of influence. Section 8. Collective harm without personal cruelty. How damage occurs by process and why no one feels responsible. One of the most difficult realities to face, especially for people who value fairness, empathy, and personal responsibility, is this. Some of the greatest harm in human systems is caused without cruelty. No raised voices. No sadism, no visible malice, just procedures. This section is about how collective harm emerges in environments shaped by instrumental control, and why the absence of personal cruelty makes that harm so hard to name, resist, or even believe. The comfort of blaming individuals. We are culturally conditioned to locate harm in people. When something goes wrong, we ask, who did this? Who is responsible? Who should be held accountable? This instinct is not wrong, but it becomes limiting when harm is produced systemically, because systems don't feel, they don't intend, they don't apologize. And when harm is caused by process rather than personality, our moral reflexes struggle to engage. There is no one to confront. How systems create moral distance. Collective harm depends on distance. Distance between decision and outcome, action and consequence, and authority and accountability. In large systems, no single person sees the whole picture. Each role is narrow, each task is local, each decision is framed as small. But the cumulative effect is large. This fragmentation of responsibility is not accidental, it's a feature of scale, and it creates a moral blind spot. I was just doing my job. One of the most common phrases in institutional harm is also one of the most revealing. I was just doing my job. This statement is often true, and that's precisely why it's so dangerous. When roles are narrowly defined, people can act ethically within their function while contributing to unethical outcomes overall. No one violates their code, no one feels malicious. And yet, harm proceeds. This is how conscience becomes compartmentalized. Harm by accumulation. Not intention. Collective harm rarely arrives as a single act. It accumulates. A policy here, a threshold there, a process update, a compliance requirement. Each change is reasonable. Each decision is justified. But over time, the human cost becomes significant. And because no single step feels harmful, the result feels inevitable rather than chosen. This is how systems normalize damage. The myth of the bad actor. In narratives of harm, there is often an expectation of a bad actor, someone who intended damage. But many instrumental systems function precisely because they don't require bad actors. They rely on compliance, role adherence, and deference to structure. People participate not because they want to harm, but because they want to belong, perform, and survive. This doesn't absolve responsibility. It explains how responsibility becomes diffuse. When ethics are replaced by roles in collective systems, ethics are often replaced by role-based reasoning. People ask, is this within my remit? Is this my responsibility? Do I have the authority to intervene? These are practical questions, but when they replace ethical ones, should this be happening? Harm gains momentum, because ethics requires someone to step outside role boundaries, and systems rarely reward that. The silence of the reasonable majority. One of the most unsettling aspects of collective harm is that it often persists despite widespread discomfort. Many people notice something is wrong, but they assume someone else will speak up, someone higher up is handling it, or that resistance would be futile. This creates a silent majority, not indifferent, but constrained. And silence, when multiplied, becomes complicity, even without intent. The normalization of harmful language. Collective harm is often accompanied by linguistic shifts. People stop saying, this is harmful, and start saying, this is unfortunate. They stop saying, this shouldn't happen, and start saying, this is how it works. Language becomes neutral, and neutrality dulls moral response. Why no one feels cruel. A defining feature of instrumental systems is that participants don't feel cruel. They may feel tired, conflicted, constrained, or resigned, but not malicious. This absence of cruelty becomes a psychological shield. If no one feels bad, harm feels abstract. And if harm feels abstract, urgency disappears. The experience of the individual inside the system. For individuals affected by collective harm, the experience is deeply disorienting. They weren't attacked. They weren't abused. They weren't singled out. They were processed. And because the harm wasn't personal, it's difficult to protest without feeling dramatic or unreasonable. People often internalize the experience. They ask, am I overreacting? Is this just how things are? Why can't I accept this? This internalization is one of the most damaging effects of collective harm. Why collective harm is so resistant to change. Changing collective harm requires more than good intentions. It requires structural accountability, ethical authority beyond roles, and permission to slow systems down. These are precisely the things instrumental systems resist. Not because they are evil, but because they threaten efficiency. And efficiency in these systems is treated as non-negotiable. The false safety of nobody meant this. One of the most common refrains after systemic harm is acknowledged is, nobody intended this. Again, this may be true, but intention is not the measure of impact. Systems that require good intentions to remain ethical are fragile. Robust systems build ethics into structure, not into personality. Reclaiming moral agency without blame understanding collective harm does not require blaming individuals. It requires reclaiming moral agency. Agency is the ability to say, this is happening, this matters, and this should be questioned. Even when roles discourage it, this is not easy, but it's the beginning of resistance that doesn't rely on villains. This section brings us to an important threshold. If harm can occur without cruelty, if clarity can coexist with damage, if empathy can be instrumental, then recovery cannot be about exposure or confrontation alone. It has to be about reorientation. In the next sections, we'll move toward that not through fixing, but through noticing. The absence of cruelty does not mean the absence of harm, and the presence of process does not absolve responsibility. Section 9, Observation Practice. Signal before meaning, reclaiming orientation without interpretation, confrontation, or fixing. Everything we've explored so far has pointed toward a single tension. Harm does not always arrive with drama. Manipulation does not always feel confusing. Power does not always look aggressive. And because of that, recovery cannot rely on exposure, analysis, or confrontation alone. It has to begin somewhere quieter. This section introduces a practice, but not a technique. There is nothing to do, nothing to implement, nothing to change. Only something to notice why observation comes before interpretation. When people exit instrumental systems, they often want answers immediately. They want to know what really happened, who was responsible, whether it was intentional, and how to prevent it from happening again. Those questions are understandable, but they come too early, because when meaning is imposed before orientation is restored, the nervous system substitutes certainty for safety. And certainty in this context can recreate the very dynamics we're trying to leave behind. This practice asks you to reverse the usual order. Signal first, meaning later. What signal means here? Signal does not mean intuition in a mystical sense, and it does not mean emotional reaction. Signal refers to physiological and behavioral shifts that occur before conscious thought. Things like your body contracting, your speech shortening, your attention narrowing, your energy is dropping, or your sense of time changing. These shifts are not conclusions. They are information, and unlike stories, signals don't argue. Why meaning can't be trusted yet? After exposure to instrumental harm, meaning becomes unstable. People often oscillate between minimizing what happened and over-explaining it. They swing between it wasn't that bad and everything was manipulation. Both responses are attempts to stabilize uncertainty, but neither restores orientation. Observation does. This practice has 3 non-negotiable rules. Do not interpret, do not confront, do not diagnose. Not others, not yourself, not the system. If you notice the urge to interpret, that's something to notice too. The practice is not about restraint as discipline. It's about restraint as protection. What you're noticing instead. Over the next few days or weeks, the invitation is simply this. Notice moments when something in you changes, not dramatically, subtly. Moments where your shoulders rise, your breath shortens, your voice becomes flatter, your responses become quicker or quieter, or your thoughts feel unusually resolved. These are not red flags. They are markers of state shift. Why state matters more than story. Instrumental systems are powerful precisely because they operate at the level of state, not narrative. They don't need to convince you intellectually. They need you to settle into a posture, compliant, efficient, reasonable, untroubled. When that posture is achieved, behavior follows automatically. Observation interrupts that automation gently, noticing without mobilizing. One of the hardest things for people with strong ethical instincts is not acting. When you notice something off, you want to respond. But response without orientation often recreates the same power imbalance, just from the opposite position. This practice asks you to sit with noticing without mobilizing, not because action is wrong, but because premature action often costs clarity. How this restores internal reference. Instrumental systems erode internal reference points by training you to defer to external logic. This practice reverses that process. By noticing your own contraction, your own withdrawal, your own compliance, you begin to rebuild a relationship with your own signals, not to obey them blindly, but to respect them as data. What this is not about hypervigilance, scanning for threat, or assuming harm. You are not watching others. You are watching yourself in relation to context. If nothing shifts, nothing shifts. That's information too. Why this avoids paranoia. Paranoia arises when meaning outruns evidence. This practice keeps evidence grounded in the body. Bodies don't catastrophize, they register. And registration without interpretation is stabilizing. When you'll want to break the rules. At some point, you'll notice something and immediately want to explain it. You'll want to say, this is manipulation. This is power. This is happening again. That impulse is understandable. And it's also the moment to pause. because naming too quickly can become a way of escaping uncertainty. This practice stays with uncertainty without drowning in it. The quiet return of choice. As observation accumulates, something subtle happens. Choice returns, not a dramatic choice, micro-choice. You notice when you agree too quickly, when you stop speaking, when you override discomfort. And because you notice it before it becomes a story, you're no longer trapped inside reaction. This is not empowerment, it's orientation. Why this works without techniques assume a problem to fix. This practice assumes a capacity to restore. Your nervous system already knows how to orient. It just needs permission to speak before logic silences it. Letting the pattern reveal itself over time, patterns emerge without effort, not patterns of bad people. Patterns of context that narrow you, environments that flatten you, situations where you disappear slightly. These patterns don't accuse, they inform. An important boundary. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. Noticing is enough. You don't owe action. You don't owe an explanation. You don't owe certainty. Orientation precedes response. This practice sets the ground for what comes next. Not resolution, not healing narratives, but integration. Integration is not about becoming immune to harm. It's about becoming less willing to abandon yourself quietly. In the final section, we'll bring this episode to a close, not by tying things up, but by settling the nervous system and pointing gently toward what comes next. Before you decide what something means, notice what it does to you. Before you explain, orient. Before you act, return to the signal. Section 10, self-reflection, prompt purpose, gentle shadow contact. Before we move into integration, we pause. Not to analyze, not to resolve, not to arrive at conclusions. Just to allow a single question to surface, without pressure, without demand, without the expectation of an answer. Where have I been asked to accept harm as necessary? That's it. No journaling required. No unpacking expected. No response owed. This question is not an instruction. It's an invitation, one that may land immediately, gradually, or not at all. If nothing arises, that's fine. If something flickers briefly and disappears, that's fine. If the question returns days or weeks later, that's fine too. The purpose here is not insight. It's contact. Why this question matters. This question is not asking where harm happened. It's asking where harm was framed, where it was positioned as unavoidable, where it was rationalized as structural, where it was justified as how things are. This distinction matters, because many people never consent to harm directly. They consent to necessity. They accept damage because it's explained well. They endure loss because it's presented as inevitable. They override discomfort because resistance is framed as unrealistic. And over time, that override becomes automatic. Why there is no need for an answers close things down. They create stories. They invite interpretation. They pull the nervous system back into analysis. This question is not meant to be answered. It's meant to be sat with and felt, to exist alongside your experience without organizing it. If you try to answer it, you may notice that your mind reaches for explanations, and that's okay. Just notice that movement. The practice here is not to resolve the question, but to let it orient you. What gentle shadow contact actually means. Shadow contact does not mean confronting darkness. It means noticing where something has been normalized, where you learned, explicitly or implicitly, that discomfort should be tolerated, impact should be minimized, or harm should be absorbed quietly for a larger good. This is not about blame, it's about inheritance. And inheritance does not require guilt to be recognized, letting the question work on its own time. You don't need to sit with this question. You don't need to revisit it deliberately. You don't need to do anything with it. If it's relevant, it will surface naturally, perhaps in a conversation, a memory, a bodily response, or a moment of hesitation. And if it never does, that too is information. Holding the question without turning it into a task. One of the most important things to resist here is productivity. This question is not here to produce insight, growth, or healing. It's here to create space. Space between explanation and acceptance. Space between logic and consent. Space where orientation can quietly return. That's enough. Section 11. The cost of power without constraint purpose. Settle, not inflame. As we bring this episode toward a close, it's important to resist the urge to tie things together too neatly. This has not been an episode about solutions. It's been an episode about seeing clearly without urgency, and clarity, when it's real, does not rush. Throughout this episode, we've explored a difficult reality. That harm does not always arrive with cruelty. That manipulation does not always feel confusing. That power does not always look aggressive. Instead, we've looked at systems where harm is logical, procedural, justified, and emotionally neutral. We've examined how clarity can silence objections, empathy can regulate rather than protect, and responsibility can diffuse until no one feels accountable. This is not comfortable terrain, but it is necessary, because these are the environments that persist not by force, but by function. The myth that keeps us asleep. There is one myth that quietly underpins many of our assumptions about harm. People who cause harm must feel something about it. Anger, cruelty, guilt, sadness, remorse. We expect emotional signals to accompany damage, and when they don't, we assume harm is not occurring or that it must be unintentional, minimal, or acceptable. This expectation is deeply ingrained. It shapes how we judge situations, how we interpret behavior, and how we decide whether something counts as wrong. But this myth obscures a more troubling truth, the reality we've been naming. The reality is this: some systems function precisely because they don't require feeling. They don't rely on empathy. They don't depend on conscience. They don't need cruelty. They require only compliance, coherence, and the smooth execution of outcomes. In these systems, harm does not need to be denied. It only needs to be explained, and explanation, when repeated often enough, becomes normalization. Why this is not a condemnation. It's important to be clear about something. This is not an argument that systems are evil, or that people within them are bad, or that power inevitably corrupts. It's an argument about constraint. Power without constraint does not need malice to cause damage. It needs only abstraction, efficiency, and the removal of friction between decision and impact. When conscience is not structurally required, it becomes optional, and an optional conscience is fragile. The cost we rarely name. The cost of power without constraint is not only external harm, it is internal erosion. People begin to doubt their discomfort, override their signals, and accept explanations that conflict with their values. Not because they are weak, but because the system is coherent, and coherence is persuasive. Over time, this erodes something subtle but vital, the capacity to remain oriented to oneself. Why this episode does not end with advice implies certainty. And certainty is not what this moment calls for. What we've been cultivating instead is orientation. Orientation is quieter than certainty. It does not demand action. It does not insist on interpretation. It simply restores your ability to locate yourself in relation to what's happening. That's enough for now. Holding what you've noticed. If you've noticed moments of recognition during this episode, moments where something clicked quietly, there's no need to do anything with them. Recognition does not require a response. In fact, an immediate response often dilutes recognition by turning it into a narrative. Let what you've noticed remain noticed. Let it settle. There is one line that captures the heart of this episode, not as a conclusion, but as an orientation to carry forward. The danger isn't that some people lack conscience, it's that we build systems that don't require one. This is not an accusation, it's an invitation to look at structure rather than personality, to ask not who is bad, but what is being rewarded, what is being normalized, what is being made unnecessary, especially when power is involved. As we close this episode, there is nothing you need to carry forward deliberately. No task to complete, no stance to adopt, no urgency to act. If anything lingers, let it linger lightly, not as a problem to solve, but as a point of orientation you can return to when needed. This work does not require vigilance. It requires presence, and presence does not strain. In the next episode, we'll turn our attention to a concept that has gained enormous traction and enormous confusion. Episode 4, The Dark Empath. An exploration of why sensitivity does not guarantee safety. Insight does not equal benevolence, and emotional intelligence, when unmoored from conscience, can become a tool of influence rather than care. If this episode has been about clarity without conscience, the next will examine empathy without protection. Until then, stay oriented, not alarmed. And remember, you don't need to see danger everywhere. You only need to notice the moments when you disappear and choose, gently, not to. You've been listening to Invisible Hands, Manipulation, Power, and the Fracture of Perception. I'm James Miller.